Cold open. The florist texted me the seating chart photos at 6:14 that morning, the way she always did before a Saturday wedding, so I could do one last check before the venue doors opened. I was standing in my own kitchen with a coffee going cold, scrolling through table 12, table 13, table 14, when I got to the head table close-up and stopped breathing. The groom's boutonniere was pinned crooked, exactly the way it always ended up crooked by 9 in the morning, no matter how many times I fixed it, because he had a habit of touching his own lapel when he was nervous. I would know that habit anywhere. I had been correcting that same crooked boutonniere on that same man for 11 years of our marriage. In 4 hours, I was going to walk into a 5-star ballroom I had personally designed, in my professional capacity as the wedding planner of record, and watch my husband marry another woman under a name that was not his own. Welcome to the quiet inheritance, where ordinary people face impossible betrayals, and prove that the strongest response isn't always the loudest. Every story ends with a lesson, a reckoning, or a victory worth waiting for. My name is Odalys Ferreira Marsh. I go by Ferreira professionally, which turns out to have mattered more than I ever could have guessed. I'm 39. I run a boutique event planning company that handles maybe 14 weddings a year, all of them the kind with champagne towers and calligraphed place cards. And up until 6:14 that Saturday morning, I believed I was married to a quiet, steady man named Gregory Marsh who traveled for work roughly 1 week out of every month, selling industrial water filtration systems to municipalities across 3 states. If you've ever had the floor of your own life open up beneath you without any warning at all, stay with me, because what I did in the 4 hours between that photo and that ceremony is not something I planned for, and it is not something I will ever regret. I need to take you back 9 years, to the year Gregory and I met, because the shape of what came later only makes sense once you understand how carefully, how patiently, the whole thing had been built. I was 30 then, 3 years into running my own event company after leaving a soul-flattening job coordinating conferences for a hotel chain, still building my client list 1 referral at a time, still doing my own flower runs at 4 in the morning because I couldn't yet afford a full-time florist on retainer. I met Gregory at, of all places, a trade conference for the hospitality industry, where he was there representing a filtration company that supplied hotel kitchens, and he'd wandered, slightly lost, into a breakout session about event logistics that had nothing to do with his actual business. He said afterward it was the only room with good coffee. I believed him, the way you believe small, charming, slightly self-deprecating things from a man who is easy to talk to and doesn't seem to be performing. Gregory was steady in a way I found enormously restful after years of working with brides who cried over ribbon colors and mothers-in-law who treated seating charts like blood feuds. He liked routines. He liked Sunday grocery runs and a specific brand of instant oatmeal and a particular reading chair that he would fall asleep in most nights with a paperback open on his chest. He traveled for work, yes, but never so much that it felt like an absence rather than a rhythm, gone Tuesday through Thursday of 1 week a month, back with small, thoughtful souvenirs, a bar of soap from a hotel he liked, a postcard from whatever small municipality he'd been pitching filtration contracts to. We married 4 years after we met. In a small ceremony I planned almost entirely myself, which people in my industry find either hilarious or deeply on brand, depending on how well they know me. For 9 years, that was my marriage. Steady, a little quiet. Not without its ordinary friction. Gregory could be maddeningly noncommittal about big decisions, would let a conversation about whether we should finally look at houses outside the city drift for months without resolution, which I'd always chalked up to a kind of low-grade conflict avoidance rather than anything more troubling. I want to be honest that there were moments, scattered across those 9 years, where something in the rhythm didn't quite add up, moments I noticed and then, the way you do with a person you trust completely, simply set back down without examining too closely. A hotel loyalty program email once arrived to our shared inbox from a city he'd told me he'd never actually visited for work. A phone that, twice in 9 years, buzzed with a text he angled away from me just slightly too quickly, followed by an explanation about a difficult client that landed just smoothly enough that I let it go. I did not, at the time, understand that I was cataloging evidence. I understood only that I loved a man who sometimes felt, in very small ways, slightly out of focus, and that I had decided, the way most people in long marriages eventually decide about their partner's minor inconsistencies, that the whole of him was worth more than the sum of those small, unaccounted-for parts. The wedding that changed everything came to my company the ordinary way, through a referral from a florist I'd worked with a dozen times, who told me a bride named Willow Castellano was looking for a planner for an autumn wedding at the Ainsworth Hotel, a 5-star property downtown with a ballroom I'd worked in perhaps 6 times before and loved for its enormous arched windows. I took the introductory call from my office on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 8 months before the wedding date, and I remember almost nothing distinctive about that first conversation, except that Willow had a warm, slightly nervous laugh and described her fiancé, whose name she gave as Julian Castellano Reyes, a hyphenated surname the two of them had apparently decided to build together for their new family, as the calmest man I've ever met, honestly. He's basically incapable of getting flustered about anything. I remember writing that down in my intake notes, calmest man I've ever met, and thinking, in the entirely unremarkable way you think idle thoughts during a work call, that it was a nice quality in a partner. I did not think, even for 1 second, that I already knew exactly what that calm looked like from the inside of a marriage. I want to be transparent about something structural here, because it matters enormously to how any of this was even possible. In the wedding industry, planners very often deal primarily, sometimes almost exclusively, with the bride, and secondarily with whichever parent is footing a significant portion of the bill. Grooms, especially calm, low-maintenance grooms, are frequently a background presence in the planning process, approving a menu here, showing up for a cake tasting there, but rarely the person a planner spends the bulk of her working hours corresponding with. Over the 8 months of planning Willow's wedding, I dealt with her, almost entirely, over email, texts, and a handful of in-person vendor meetings. I never once met Julian Castellano Reyes in person. I saw him, precisely twice, in photographs Willow sent me for mood boards and seating chart purposes. A save-the-date photo, taken at some distance on a beach at dusk, faces slightly soft-focused against the sunset in the particular way engagement photographers favor, and a single formal engagement portrait, taken indoors, that I recall glancing at for perhaps 4 seconds while confirming table linens matched his suit color. Filed away in a folder among 200 other wedding details I was juggling that season, never once triggering the recognition that should, in hindsight, have been instant and undeniable. I have turned this over in my mind more times than I can count since. The strange mercy and cruelty of how easily a person can miss the obvious when the obvious arrives disguised as ordinary professional distance. Gregory, for his part, had spent 9 years of marriage referring to his work travel using vague, interchangeable language, client meetings, site visits, the usual circuit that gave me no reason to ever cross-reference his calendar against my own client list, 2 entirely separate compartments of a life I had, without realizing it, allowed to remain almost completely unconnected from each other. Because that is simply how a healthy division between a spouse's career and your own tends to function, until the day it doesn't. The photograph that finally connected the 2 compartments arrived, as I told you, at 6:14 on the morning of the wedding, sent by my florist, Priya Deng, a meticulous woman I'd worked with for 6 years who had developed a habit, entirely her own idea, of sending me a full run of table photographs before every event so I could catch any last-minute arrangement issues before doors opened. Among the dozen photos, that morning was one of the head table's place settings, and tucked into the corner of that frame, because Priya had also, as a courtesy, photographed the boutonnieres laid out for pinning, was a close-up of the grooms, sitting on white linen beside a small handwritten place card that read, in careful calligraphy, Julian. It was not the boutonniere itself that stopped me, not at first. It was the small, unremarkable detail beside it in the frame, half visible at the edge of the photo, that made my stomach drop before my conscious mind had even finished processing why. A cufflink sitting loose on the linen beside the boutonniere, waiting to be attached, engraved with a small, distinctive monogram. A stylized G, nested inside a compass rose design, that I recognized instantly, completely, with the kind of bodily certainty that arrives before rational thought catches up, because I had bought that exact pair of cufflinks myself, from a small jeweler in the Arts District, as a 5th anniversary gift for my husband, 6 years earlier. I sat very still at my kitchen table for what felt like a long time and was probably closer to 90 seconds, staring at a cufflink in a photograph of a wedding I had spent 8 months planning, before I did the thing my entire professional life had trained me to do under pressure, which is to stop feeling and start verifying. If you've ever had a single small detail rearrange every assumption you'd built your life on top of, all at once, standing barefoot in your own kitchen, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that settled over me in that moment. Stay with me, because what I found in the next 4 hours is not a story I could have written for a client. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this one before the doors open. I did not call Gregory. I did not call Willow. I did what I have done, professionally, for over a decade, whenever a wedding day threatens to unravel around some unexpected detail no one anticipated. I built a timeline, methodically, using only information I could verify myself, before allowing a single emotion to dictate a single action. I opened my laptop and pulled the full client file for Willow Castellano's wedding, which I keep, as I keep every client file, meticulously organized by vendor, by payment schedule, by every communication thread across 8 months of planning. I went first to the engagement photo I had glanced at for 4 seconds back in February and had not looked at closely since, and I made myself look at it now, fully, without flinching for the first time. It was Gregory. Not a resemblance, not a coincidence of similar build and haircut, but unmistakably, completely my husband, wearing a suit I did not recognize, standing in front of a backdrop I did not recognize, with his arm around a woman I had exchanged perhaps 400 emails with over the past 8 months, and had never once, not for a single second, connected to the man sleeping in my bed 3 nights out of every week. Once the recognition landed fully, the rest of it assembled itself with a speed that genuinely frightened me. The way a lifetime of small, previously dismissed inconsistencies can suddenly reorganize themselves into a coherent, damning shape the instant you finally have the one piece of information that makes sense of all the others. I pulled up Gregory's travel calendar, which he had, for 9 years, kept in a shared digital calendar app for scheduling convenience, listing only vague labels: client site visit, regional meetings, filtration conference, never full addresses, never client names, a level of vagueness I had simply absorbed as the unremarkable texture of a spouse's unglamorous sales job. I cross-referenced those travel dates, going back as far as the calendar app's history allowed, roughly 4 years, against the dates on Willow's own wedding planning emails, specifically the dates she mentioned, in passing, throughout our correspondence, when Julian had been traveling for work and unavailable for a vendor call or cake tasting. The overlap was not partial. It was total. Every single date Gregory had logged as travel over the past 4 years. I stopped checking further back only because the calendar app's records didn't extend beyond that, corresponded, without a single exception, to a date Willow had independently described Julian as being away on business. 2 calendars, kept by 2 women who had never met each other's version of the same man, describing the exact same absences using the exact same vague, unverifiable language, because the language itself had clearly been carefully calibrated, over years, to survive exactly this kind of comparison without ever needing to. I sat with my laptop open, coffee fully cold now, and made myself do the next thing, the harder thing, the thing that required setting aside every ounce of the vertigo I was feeling and simply gathering more information before I let myself react to any of it. I searched, using nothing more sophisticated than a public records search tool I'd used professionally before for vendor background checks, the name Julian Castellano raised, and found, within minutes, a residential lease agreement, filed 18 months earlier, for a 2-bedroom apartment 40 minutes across the city from the house Gregory and I shared, listing Julian Castellano Reyes and Willow Castellano as co-tenants. I searched further and found, filed with the state 11 months earlier, a formal legal name change petition, a document any citizen can file, changing one's legal first and middle name while retaining an original surname component, a process considerably easier and less scrutinized than most people assume, approved and finalized, converting a birth name I recognized instantly, because it was the name printed on our own marriage certificate 9 years earlier, into Julian, a new first name, paired with a newly hyphenated surname built by combining a fragment of his own birth surname with Willow's. Gregory Marsh, my husband of 9 years, had legally become, on paper, in the eyes of the state, a man named Julian Castellano Reyes, 11 months before he was scheduled to marry a woman I had spent 8 months helping plan a wedding for, in a ballroom I had personally selected the floral arch for, 300 feet from a florist who had, entirely by accident, photographed the one piece of jewelry in the world capable of exposing the entire architecture of the lie in a single frame. I want to be honest about the several minutes that followed that discovery, because I think the honest version matters more than a composed one. I did not feel, in that moment, coldly strategic. I felt something closer to a physical illness, a hollowing-out sensation that made me put my head down on my own kitchen table for a while, breathing carefully, the way you breathe through a wave of nausea you're trying to will away through sheer discipline. 9 years. 9 years of Sunday grocery runs, and a specific brand of oatmeal, and a paperback falling asleep on his chest, running in parallel, the entire time, alongside some other version of him building a second, entirely separate, legally documented life with a woman who had, at some point in the past 18 months, become close enough to me professionally that I had personally approved the exact shade of blush pink for her bridesmaids' dresses. I let myself have those minutes. Then I did what I have always done under pressure, professionally, and it turned out, in the single worst personal crisis of my life. I made a plan, methodically, with a clock running, because the wedding I had been contracted to execute flawlessly was scheduled to begin its ceremony portion in exactly 3 hours and 40 minutes, whether or not the woman who had built it discovered, that same morning, that the groom was her own husband under an assumed legal identity. I called one person before I did anything else, a family law attorney named Desmond Ockhaffer, whom I had, with a strange, useful foresight I still don't fully understand, met socially 2 years earlier through a mutual client, and had kept his card, the way you keep the card of anyone competent whose services you hope you'll never need. I reached him at home on a Saturday morning, apologized for the intrusion, and told him, as plainly and factually as I could manage with my voice still not entirely steady, what I had found. Desmond, to his enormous credit, did not waste time expressing shock or sympathy, both of which I appreciated more than he probably realized, and instead asked me a series of precise, useful questions. Was I certain of my identification of Gregory in the photographs? Did I have documentation of the lease, the name change filing, the calendar overlap? Was there, to my knowledge, any possibility this was a legally distinct situation? A divorce I'd somehow forgotten, an annulment, anything that might mean Gregory was not, in fact, currently and simultaneously my legal husband and this morning's groom. I confirmed, checking our own marriage's status through the same public records search, that Gregory Marsh and I remained legally married, with no divorce or annulment filing of any kind on record, anywhere, at any point in the past 9 years. Desmond was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then he said something that steadied me more than almost anything else that morning. "If everything you're describing is accurate," he said, "your husband is not just conducting an affair. He is attempting to enter into a second marriage while still legally married to you, which constitutes bigamy, a criminal offense in this state, separate and apart from any civil issues around the fraud he's perpetrated against this other woman, who has, from everything you're telling me, no idea any of this is happening." He paused. "You have several paths available to you this morning, Odalys, and I want you to understand all of them before you choose one, because the version of this that happens in the next 4 hours is going to be the version that everyone remembers." I asked him to lay out those paths plainly, because plainness was, at that moment, the only thing I could actually process. The first path, he explained, was the simplest and most private. Contact Gregory directly, right now, before the ceremony, confront him with what I knew, and give him the chance to call off today's wedding himself, quietly, under whatever excuse he could construct, sparing Willow the full public shape of what had happened to her, though not, Desmond noted carefully, sparing her the eventual truth entirely, since a cancelled wedding with no real explanation would likely only delay her discovering the full reality by days or weeks at most. The second path was to contact Willow directly, privately, before the ceremony, and tell her what I'd found, allowing her to make her own decision about how to handle her own wedding day with full information, which carried the risk, Desmond noted, of Willow not believing me, or believing me but still choosing, in the chaos of a wedding morning, some version of denial or delay rather than immediate confrontation. The third path, the one Desmond described with the most caution, was to do nothing privately and instead ensure that the truth surfaced during the ceremony itself, publicly, in front of both families, which he warned plainly, was the option most likely to cause maximum damage to everyone involved, including, potentially, to my own professional reputation, given that I was the paid planner of record for an event I now had reason to believe was fraudulent from its very foundation. I sat with all three options for perhaps 90 seconds, my mind moving through them with a clarity that surprised me, given the hour and the shock still sitting heavy in my chest. I told Desmond, finally, that I did not want maximum public damage. I did not want revenge theater. What I wanted, I told him, was for the truth to be established clearly, calmly, and undeniably, in a way that protected Willow from marrying a man who was already legally married to someone else, protected myself legally and professionally by making sure I was never positioned as either complicit or as someone who'd acted rashly without proper documentation, and left Gregory with nowhere left to stand once the facts were laid out plainly. "That's the right instinct," Desmond said. "Let's build it that way. Here is what we did, and I want to walk through it carefully, because I think the mechanics matter as much as the outcome." Desmond advised, first, that I not attempt to confront Gregory directly that morning, for a specific legal reason I hadn't considered. Doing so privately, without any independent witness or documentation of the conversation, would allow him the opportunity to talk his way into some version of damage control before anyone else had accurate information, potentially convincing Willow, or her family, of some alternate explanation before I'd had the chance to establish the facts on solid ground. Instead, Desmond recommended I do exactly what I would do for any legitimate professional concern about an event I was contracted to run. Document everything, formally and immediately, and involve the venue's own management, since, as the wedding's licensed vendor of record, I had both a professional obligation and a contractual right to raise a serious legal concern about the legitimacy of the event I'd been hired to execute. I spent the next hour, from roughly 7:00 to 8:00 that morning, assembling a formal documentation packet, the way I would for any client dispute, because it turns out that 11 years of building meticulous vendor files translates disturbingly well into building a case against your own husband. I printed the public records, the lease agreement listing Julian Castellano-Reyes and Willow Castellano as co-tenants, the finalized legal name change petition, with its clear, undeniable link between Gregory Marsh's original legal name and his new one, our own marriage certificate, still valid, 9 years old, never dissolved, the photograph of the cufflinks, cross-referenced against a receipt I still had, buried in an old email confirmation from the jeweler, for that exact 5th anniversary purchase 6 years earlier. And the calendar overlap, laid out in a simple 2-column spreadsheet, Gregory's logged travel dates on one side, Willow's independently described absences of Julian on the other, 4 years of dates lining up with a precision that no honest coincidence could have produced. At 8:15, I called the Ainsworth Hotel's events director, a composed, unflappable woman named Renee Castillo, whom I had worked with on perhaps a dozen events over the years and trusted implicitly, and told her, as calmly and factually as I could manage, that I had discovered a serious legal issue regarding today's 10 o'clock ceremony that required her involvement before doors opened to guests. I did not, on that first call, explain the full personal dimension of what I'd found. I told her only that I had documentation suggesting the groom scheduled to marry that morning was already legally married to another woman, and that I believed, as both the event's planner and, separately, as a private citizen with independent legal advice, that the hotel needed to be aware of this before allowing the ceremony to proceed, given the significant liability exposure a venue could face knowingly hosting what might constitute a fraudulent marriage. Renee, to her considerable credit, took this with the exact kind of measured seriousness the moment required, asked me to come to the hotel immediately with whatever documentation I had, and told me she would loop in the hotel's own legal counsel before making any further decisions about how the morning would proceed. I did not tell her, in that first call, that I was myself the other legal wife in question. I told her that fact, plainly and directly, the moment I arrived at the hotel 40 minutes later, because I understood, even in the fog of that morning, that withholding it would only make the situation more volatile once it inevitably surfaced, and because Desmond had advised, correctly, that establishing my own complete honesty from the earliest possible moment was the single most important thing I could do to protect both my legal position and my professional reputation going forward. I arrived at the Ainsworth at 8:55, walked through the same service entrance I'd walked through 100 times before for 100 other weddings, and sat down in Renee's small office with the documentation packet spread across her desk, and told her the full truth. That the groom scheduled to marry Willow Castellano in just over an hour was named, legally, until 11 months ago, Gregory Marsh, and that Gregory Marsh was, and had been for 9 years, my own husband. Renee did not say much for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the hotel's general counsel, a process that took, agonizingly, almost 30 minutes, during which I sat in her office watching the clock, aware that Willow was almost certainly at that exact moment somewhere in the bridal suite 2 floors above us, having her hair finished, entirely unaware that her wedding day had already, quietly, structurally, come apart before a single guest had arrived. The hotel's counsel, once briefed, was direct, and I thought appropriately cautious. He advised Renee that the hotel could not, in good conscience, knowingly allow a ceremony to proceed once presented with credible documentation, suggesting one party was already legally married to a third party present in the building. Both because of the venue's own liability exposure, and because, frankly, facilitating what could constitute a bigamous marriage carried legal risk the hotel had no interest in absorbing. He recommended that the ceremony be paused, formally, before guests were seated, and that both the bride and groom be informed privately, separately if possible, before any public gathering occurred, giving everyone involved the chance to absorb the situation with some measure of dignity rather than in front of 200 wedding guests. I want to tell you, honestly, that some smaller, angrier part of me had spent the drive to the hotel imagining a different version of this morning, a version where the truth landed in front of every guest at once, where Gregory's face and Willow's face both crumbled simultaneously in front of an audience the way his lies had been constructed to eventually be witnessed by no one at all. I understand that impulse. I don't think it's a shameful one. But I also understood, sitting in Renee's office at 9:20 that morning with the clock closing in, that the version of this I actually wanted, the version I could live with for the rest of my life, was not one built on spectacle. It was one built on the same thing I had spent my entire career building for other people's weddings. Precise, competent, undeniable execution of the truth, delivered clearly, without cruelty, in a way that left no room for anyone to argue afterward about what had actually happened. Renee and the hotel's counsel agreed to my proposed approach, which Desmond and I had worked out in the car on the drive over, largely over speakerphone. Rather than a public confrontation, Renee would ask Willow's parents, who, as it happened, were footing the majority of the wedding's cost and had a suite of their own 2 doors down from the bridal suite, to join a private meeting in the hotel's small executive conference room at 9:40, 20 minutes before the ceremony's scheduled start, under the framing of an urgent contractual matter requiring immediate resolution before the ceremony can proceed. Language vague enough to secure their presence without triggering panic, but serious enough that they would understand, immediately upon walking in, that something significant was happening. At 9:40, I sat at the head of a small conference table with the documentation packet arranged in front of me, Riane beside me, Desmond patched in by speakerphone from his home office, as Willow's parents walked in, followed, a few minutes later at Riane's specific request, by Gregory himself, who had been located in the groom's suite by hotel staff, and told only that a contractual issue required his immediate presence. I watched Gregory's face when he walked through that door and saw me sitting at the table. I have thought about that specific expression many times since, the way a person's face can hold, for a fraction of a second, several completely contradictory things at once, confusion, because I should not have been there at all in his understanding of that morning. Recognition, arriving a beat later, of exactly what my presence meant. And then, underneath both, something I can only describe as a kind of exhausted, almost relieved collapse, the particular look of a man who has spent 11 months maintaining an architecture, so elaborate it had clearly, on some level, been waiting to fall. "Odalys," he said, and his voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it in 9 years of marriage. "What are you doing here?" "I'm the wedding planner," I said, and I want you to understand that I said it as flatly, as factually, as I have ever said anything in my life. "I have been for 8 months. I planned this wedding. I picked the florals. I approved the seating chart. I have never once in 8 months met the groom in person because you were never in the room for a single vendor meeting. Sit down, Gregory." He did not sit down immediately. Willow's father, a broad, quiet man named Harold Castellano, who had, up to that point, been sitting with the polite, slightly wary patience of a man who assumed this was some kind of vendor payment dispute, looked between us with a growing, dawning alarm. "Someone needs to explain what's happening right now," he said. "My daughter is upstairs getting ready to walk down an aisle in 20 minutes. I laid the documents out on the table, one at a time, the way I had planned to in the car, the way I imagine, in some strange echo I did not consciously intend. Other people in other impossible family situations have done before me, letting paper carry weight that words alone cannot. The marriage certificate first, mine and Gregory's, 9 years old, unbroken. Then the lease agreement, Julian Castellano-Reyes and Willow Castellano, co-tenants, 18 months. Then the legal name change petition, the clean, undeniable line connecting Gregory Marsh to Julian Castellano-Reyes, filed and approved 11 months earlier. Then the calendar spreadsheet, 4 years of overlapping absences, described by 2 women who had never known of each other's existence using language calibrated, deliberately, to survive exactly this kind of comparison. Willow's mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and reached for her husband's arm. Harold Castellano read through the documents with the slow, careful attention of a man forcing himself to absorb something his body was actively resisting, and when he finally looked up, his face had gone the particular gray of someone doing math he desperately did not want to be doing. "Julian," he said, and I understood, watching him say it, that some part of him was still testing the name, still hopping in the last available seconds, that there was some explanation that didn't mean what it plainly, undeniably meant. "Is this true?" Gregory, I will call him Gregory for the rest of this, because that is who he legally, undeniably, still was to me, stood very still for a long moment, and then he did the thing I think, in the end, told me everything I actually needed to know about the last 11 months of his life. He did not deny it. He did not reach for an explanation. He simply said, quietly, "I can explain," which is, I have come to understand, the sentence people say only when they know, on some level, that there is no explanation actually capable of undoing what's already on the table. I did not ask him to try. Desmond, still on speakerphone, spoke into the silence with the calm, procedural clarity of someone whose entire job is preventing exactly this kind of moment from spiraling into something worse than it already was. "Mr. Castellano," he said, addressing Harold directly, I'd strongly recommend that the ceremony scheduled for this morning not proceed, given that it would constitute an attempt to enter into a bigamous marriage, which carries serious legal consequences for all parties involved, including potentially your daughter, depending on how the state's statutes are applied in cases where one party is unaware of the other spouse's existing marriage. I'd also recommend that your daughter be informed of this situation directly and privately, as soon as possible, ideally before any guests arrive, so that she has the opportunity to process this with some dignity rather than in front of an audience. Harold Castellano stood up from the table with the slow, deliberate movement of a man holding himself together through sheer will, and said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very hard, "I'm going to go tell my daughter myself." He looked at Gregory once, a look I will not attempt to describe because I don't think any description would do it justice, and walked out of the room. I want to tell you what happened next as plainly as I can, because I think the plainness of it matters more than any dramatization could. Willow's father went upstairs to the bridal suite alone, at his own insistence, and told his daughter in private, without an audience, what had been discovered downstairs. I was not in the room for that conversation, and I have never asked either of them to describe it to me in detail, because I understood, even in the chaos of that morning, that whatever happened in that room belonged to Willow, not to me, not to this story, not to anyone else's version of events. What I do know is that the ceremony scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning did not happen. Renee's staff, working quickly and quietly, redirected the small number of early-arriving guests to the hotel's lounge with an apologetic explanation about an unforeseen delay, while the family worked out, upstairs, what to actually tell the 200 people who had traveled, in some cases from considerable distances, for a wedding that no longer had a legal groom capable of marrying anyone. I left the hotel a little before 11, once it became clear that my presence, however necessary it had been to establish the truth, was no longer serving any useful purpose in a room full of a family absorbing a devastation I had, entirely without intending to, been the instrument of delivering. I remember sitting in my car in the hotel's parking structure for a long time afterward, engine off, hands still on the wheel, feeling a version of stillness I don't fully have words for even now. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and heavier than either. The particular exhaustion of a person who has just watched the entire architecture of her adult life confirmed as false in the space of a single morning. If you've ever discovered, in the space of a few hours, that an entire decade of your life was running in parallel to something you never knew existed, you already know exactly the kind of silence that follows. Stay with me, because what happened over the following months is not the part of this story people expect. Subscribe now so you don't lose it. I did not go home that day, not directly. I drove to my sister's apartment across town and sat on her couch for 6 hours while she made tea I mostly didn't drink and asked, gently, only the questions I seemed able to answer. And I told her everything slowly, in the disordered way trauma tends to come out. The cufflink first, then the calendar, then the conference room, then Harold Castellano's face reading a legal document that ended his daughter's wedding day. My sister, to her enormous credit, did not tell me what to feel. She simply sat with me while I felt all of it, in whatever order it insisted on arriving. I filed for divorce 9 days later, through Desmond, who by then had become considerably more than the family lawyer I'd once met socially and kept a business card from out of vague professional foresight. The grounds were straightforward, given the circumstances. I had, after all, discovered irrefutable documentary evidence that my husband had legally changed his name and attempted to enter into a second marriage while still married to me, a fact pattern that made the divorce proceedings themselves almost anticlimactically simple compared to the 4 hours that had preceded them. Gregory did not contest the filing. I have wondered since whether some part of him understood, that morning in the conference room, that the marriage, both marriages, in their entirely different ways, had already ended the moment I walked through that door with a folder full of paper. The criminal side of things moved more slowly, and, I want to be honest, more uncomfortably than the divorce did. Bigamy statutes vary considerably by state, and the specific charges Gregory ultimately faced were, according to Desmond, somewhat complicated by the fact that no marriage ceremony had actually been completed. The state's prosecutors, evaluating the case, ultimately focused less on a completed bigamous marriage, since none had occurred, and more on the fraudulent legal name change filing itself, which Gregory had used provably to conceal his existing marital status from both Willow and the state marriage license office, where he'd applied for the license under his new legal name, a process that constituted its own separate offense. I sat through 2 brief court appearances over the following year, more out of a strange, unresolved need to see the process through than out of any hunger for a particular outcome. And Gregory ultimately accepted a plea agreement involving probation, a fine, and a formal record that would follow him, permanently, in any future background check. I want to tell you about Willow now, because I think her part of this story matters as much as mine, and because what happened between us afterward is, I think, the piece people find most surprising when I tell this story at all. I did not expect to hear from Willow Castellano again. I assumed, reasonably, that I would remain forever attached in her mind to the worst morning of her life, an association no amount of professional courtesy could realistically survive. I was wrong. She called me 11 days after the wedding that never happened, her voice steadier than I expected, and asked if I would be willing to meet her for coffee. Not for the wedding, she clarified quickly. Just, I don't really have anyone else who actually understands what happened, and everyone in my life keeps asking me questions I don't know how to answer, and you're the only person I know who was in that room. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had any prior connection to, deliberately neutral ground, and sat across from each other for nearly 3 hours. 2 women who had spent 8 months corresponding about flower arrangements and seating charts without either of us understanding we were, in the most literal sense possible, married to the same man. Willow told me things that morning I have never fully shared with anyone else, and I won't share most of them here either, because I think some of what passed between us belongs only to the 2 of us. But I will tell you this much. She was not, in any way, complicit. She had met Julian 3 years earlier at a professional conference in another city, and had known him only, entirely, completely, as a single man with a slightly complicated relationship to his own name. He'd told her early on that he'd legally changed it years before meeting her, following what he described as a difficult period. In his 20s, he preferred not to discuss in detail, an explanation vague enough to satisfy ordinary curiosity without inviting deeper questions. The same careful, calibrated vagueness he had apparently spent years perfecting, on both sides of a life split cleanly down the middle. Willow asked me, near the end of that first coffee, the question I imagined she'd been building toward the entire time. "Did you know?" she said. "Before that morning, was there ever a moment in 9 years where some part of you knew?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, because I owed her honesty more than I owed either of us comfort. There were small things, I told her. A hotel email that didn't quite fit a story. A phone angled away from me once or twice. Nothing that ever added up to a shape I could name. "I think," I said, and I remember this being the first time I'd actually said it out loud to anyone, including myself. "I think he was very, very good at making sure none of it ever added up to a shape either of us could name, for exactly as long as he needed it not to." Willow nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders eased very slightly, the particular relief of someone who has just been told, by the one person qualified to confirm it, that her own instincts hadn't failed her, that the deception had been built specifically, skillfully, to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny 2 reasonably intelligent, reasonably attentive women had each, independently, given it over years. We have stayed, since that first coffee, in a strange, careful, genuinely warm kind of contact. Not close friends, exactly, not the way people become close friends under ordinary circumstances, but something adjacent to it. 2 people bound by an experience so specific that almost no one else in either of our lives can fully understand it. She sent me a card, 6 months later, letting me know she'd started seeing someone new, someone she described, with a small, careful joke I appreciated more than she probably realized, as aggressively, almost suspiciously transparent about his schedule. I sent one back telling her I was glad, and I meant it more completely than I expected to. I want to talk, before I close this out, about what I actually did with the year that followed, because I think that part matters at least as much as the confrontation itself. I did not, in the aftermath, sell my company's story to some tabloid outlet that came sniffing around once word of a wedding planner discovers groom is her own husband. Scandals started circulating in the smaller, gossipy corners of the local event industry. And it did circulate, faster and further than I would have liked, given how small that professional world actually is. I gave exactly one interview, to a respected local journalist I trusted, laying out the facts plainly, without embellishment, largely because I understood that some version of this story was going to exist in public regardless of my participation, and I preferred it exist accurately rather than shaped entirely by second-hand gossip and speculation. I kept my company running through all of it, which I will admit took more discipline than almost anything else in that entire year. I had 4 other weddings on my calendar in the 2 months immediately following that Saturday morning, and I executed every single one of them with the same precision I always had, because my clients, whatever chaos was unfolding in my own life, deserved the version of me they had hired. Not the version currently rebuilding herself from the inside out. I think, looking back, that discipline was its own kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to let what Gregory had done to my personal life bleed into or diminish the professional life I had built, with considerable care, entirely on my own, years before he ever wandered into a hospitality conference looking for good coffee. 14 months after that morning at the Ainsworth, I used part of my settlement, along with savings I'd been quietly building since the divorce filing, to open a second location for my company in a neighboring city, something I'd talked about doing, vaguely, for years, always deferred by the same low-grade conflict avoidance around big decisions that I now understand, with considerable clarity, had never actually been mutual indecision at all. It had been Gregory, consistently, gently, steering every major shared decision toward delay, because a house we never bought, a location we never expanded to, was one less anchor tying him permanently to a life he was, the entire time, already quietly building an exit from. I think about that cufflink often, the small, specific detail that unraveled 9 years in the space of a single morning. I bought it as a gift meant to mark 5 years of a marriage I believed, completely, was exactly what it appeared to be. It turned out, instead, to be the one piece of physical evidence careful enough, personal enough, that even a man who had spent 11 months meticulously building a second legal identity couldn't quite bring himself to leave behind for his wedding day. Some small, sentimental oversight in an otherwise disciplined architecture of deception. The one thread he forgot, or perhaps simply couldn't resist, that ended up unraveling the entire thing. Here's what I've learned, sitting some evenings now in the new office of my second location, going over seating charts for people whose weddings I fully intend to make sure are exactly what they appear to be. People can build an entire second life running in careful parallel to a first one, for years, if they are patient enough, calm enough, disciplined enough about which small details they allow to overlap. But somewhere, almost always, there is one detail too personal, too specific, too carefully chosen by someone who loved them honestly, that they cannot quite bring themselves to leave out of the frame. And once that detail surfaces, once you finally see it clearly for what it actually is, the whole architecture, however many years it took to build, does not need to be torn down loudly. It only needs the truth, laid out plainly, on a table, in a room with the right people finally present to see it. If you've ever discovered, all at once, that something you built your entire life around wasn't what it appeared to be, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. If some small detail in your life has never quite added up to a shape you could name, trust that instinct enough to actually look, gently, carefully, long before you need the truth to hold up a wedding morning or anything else. Comment, the one who found the cufflink, if you made it to the end with me. Share this with someone who's ever had to rebuild after discovering the ground under them wasn't solid, and subscribe to the quiet inheritance, because there's always another morning, another photograph, and another truth waiting for someone patient enough to notice it.